Come on, 49ers. Come on. Wait, what? No, 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 no! I just lost 18 grand on that game. But that brings me very neatly into the subject of today's book, The Digger's Game. Yes, welcome back to Ellroy Reads, the show where I look at a book that was very special in the life, the education, the culture, the inspiration of James Ellroy. And speaking of James Ellroy, there's a marvelous new biography out of James Ellroy. It was released just last year. It's called Love Me, Fierce and Danger. It's by Stephen Powell. Never heard of him, but he's a handsome fellow, I'm sure. Anyway, so today's book, The Digger's Game by George V. Higgins, is a marvelous thriller, crime thriller. And it was a huge inspiration to Ellroy. So let me tell you a little bit about the book. And then let me tell you a little bit about why Ellroy thinks it's so special. And he's quite right, it's a wonderful book. So George V. Higgins was a very distinguished man in his own right, not just as an author. He was a lawyer, a college professor, a journalist, and of course an author. His career started in the law, and he rose to be assistant district attorney in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He worked in Boston. He got to know the Boston underworld quite well because he worked on anti-organized crime cases. And he had a marvelous ear for how criminals talk, how both cops and criminals talk, and in some cases they're kind of indistinguishable. In private practice, he represented such notable clients as Aldrich Cleaver and G. Gordon Liddy. And he was remarkably industrious. His first novel, The Friends of Eddie Coyle, was dubbed an overnight success. It was a bestseller. It was filmed very well by Peter Yates and featuring a marvelous late career turn by Robert Mitchum and a terrific supporting cast, Richard Johnson, lots of great American character actors. But Higgins disputed this. He said it was not an overnight success because he'd spent 17 years trying to get published, and he'd written 14 novels prior to this point. And he ended up destroying those novels after The Friends of Eddie Coyle was published. He felt that he wanted to move forward and not dwell on the failures of the past. So he had marvelous grit, as you can imagine, working in the courtroom, in the court system, against hardened criminals and against the system itself in some ways. And really, for a short period of time in the early 70s, he probably was America's most distinguished, most up-and-coming, the hot new thing crime writer. He really invented a style that set him apart from almost anybody else. He said he got it mostly from a short story writer, John O'Hara. But in crime fiction, it was really quite new, and one of his buddies in those days was Elmore Leonard, and they had a quite famous meeting where they decided that they did not have to follow in the footsteps of Hammett and Chandler, which is where many of their contemporaries were still trying to imitate in the early 1970s, that they would pave their own way. And if you're an Elmore Leonard fan and you like kind of mismatched dumb criminals and capers that never quite succeed, and you have to constantly change your plans because things have a tendency to go wrong, then you're going to like George V. Higgins and The Digger's Game. I could have picked The Friends of Eddie Coyle, which I really liked, or I could have picked Coogan's Trade, which was filmed a few years ago as Killing Them Softly. The novel I love, the film Killing Them Softly I kind of liked, although I had at least one friend who absolutely hated it. Because Higgins is very hard to capture on screen, because he's very, very reliant on dialogue and less so on action. The action was really alluded to in dialogue. In fact, narrative, resolution, character, all comes through in dialogue. So even at about 150 pages, a very short novel, as you can see, you can read it in an evening. Higgins isn't quite for everyone, and his career did kind of tail off a little bit. I'll talk a bit more about that later. So The Digger's Game, the basic plot is our protagonist is Jerry the Digger Doherty. And he is a saloon owner, petty criminal. He has a stressful life. He has a very nagging wife, although they have a very amorous relationship. They have 4 kids. His brother's a priest, and you might say his brother is his conscience, although this is a priest who's, shall we say, been around the parish a bit. He knows that this is a fallen world. 1970s Boston is a pretty, it's not pre-lapsarian, put it that way. It's a pretty rough place. And Jerry has got himself into big trouble. He's an ex-con, he's done time, but now he's really up against it because he was lured to Vegas by a conman and he racked up $18,000 in debts on markers. And now the time has come to pay the markers. And there's a very nasty loan shark character called the Greek who is going to do extremely nasty things to the Digger. Let's call him the Digger. He's referred to as the Digger throughout. To the Digger if he doesn't pay up in full. So the Digger has to pay up, and what do you do when you need that sort of money quickly? Well, you turn to crime. So he hatches this kind of heist plan to steal these furs, these precious furs, and fence them. And he's got to get the gang together. It's the usual heist plan type of thing, and you think the payoff is good. But in this case, even if the payoff, even if it works, the money goes straight to other people. So it's not going to make him rich. This is, not like the One Last Job heist books or narratives. This is just to save his life, essentially. And there's other things at play as well. The Greek is in trouble with the Italians. The crime here is divided along ethnic lines. I think Boston today would be very different ethnically. Immigration changes over the decades, the kind of demographics of the city. But it's very interesting to read what Boston was like in the 1970s, where you have Irish, Italians, Greeks, mostly European makeup to the city. So the Greek's in trouble with the Italians, and you start to think, is he going to survive? Because if he doesn't survive, then does that leave the Digger off the hook? And other Italians are in trouble with other Italians for bringing in the Greek. So there's just this endless series of bad choices, bad consequences, bad karma, and basically, bad fates all around. But it's riveting to read. It's very funny. It's salty. It feels like grubby. You can really feel that kind of urban decay that if you've ever watched a documentary about, say, 1970s New York or any major city, Philadelphia or on the East Coast in the 1970s, and just the rot that had set in, because of the economic crisis, Watergate, the leaving gold standard, the oil crisis. You really sense these cities in decay and these communities absolutely crumbling. This is long before gentrification or any kind of urban renewal. So it's a marvelous book, and Ellroy read it roughly when it came out, and this was a bad time for Ellroy because he was suffering in LA, on the West Coast. He knew a lot about urban poverty and urban decrepitude because he was often homeless, he was struggling with addictions, he was in and out of jail. So when Judge V. Higgins comes along, and Ellroy, it might seem deluded considering his circumstances, but he's in and out of jail and he's got these dreams of being this great crime novelist. He reads Judge V. Higgins, and again he'd grown up on Chandler and Hammett, and he loved them for what they were. But he reads Higgins and he senses an author who speaks his language, who has this marvelous ear for dialogue, and much of the dialogue, if you become a fan of, if you're a fan of, say, David Mamet, the playwright and filmmaker, who really came to prominence more in the 1980s, you'll notice that criminals always tend to think that somebody's listening in. So they gab a lot, they're garrulous. There's a heck of a lot of talk here, but people talk around the subject. And a lot of the talk goes nowhere, a lot of the plans go nowhere. Um, so there's a lot of negotiation and obviously a lot of kind of machismo, keeping your reputation up, and it all comes across as very riveting. You're really interested in what's going to happen next. Ellroy read the novel. By 1981, his first novel was published, and if you like, in Love Me First in Danger, the biography which I wrote, yeah, I'm that handsome biographer. The the correspondence he had with Nellie Saban, who was only his second editor, his first editor left the scene very quickly. The correspondence Ellroy had with Nellie Saban, he mentions two crime writers who are the only geniuses working today. One is Ross MacDonald, who was much more traditional and I suppose conservative in the mould of the Chandler Private Eye. He wrote the Lou Archer novels. And the other was George V. Higgins. Um, when I spoke to Ellroy, because I spoke to him a lot during the writing of the biography, he has described Higgins' world as a milieu I never could have imagined. And it's fair to say that some of Ellroy's more outwardly comic characters like Danny Getchell and Fred Otash, who is now taking a bit more seriously, is writing full-length novels about Otash. The Enchanted was his most recent, and I think a return to form. But some of the more outwardly comic characters, both criminals or just people who know how to carve a buck, owe a lot to the criminals and the cops of George V. Higgins' world. Ellroy considered reaching out to Higgins sometime in the 1990s, by which time Ellroy was fairly established himself. He just wanted to say thank you. You know, maybe they could arrange a sit down, maybe they could have coffee or something. But a third party advised him not to. They said, "Don't, Higgins. You won't like him. He's dyspeptic. He's bilbulous. He's got a personality you would absolutely hate." No, I can't speak to that. Sadly, George V. Higgins died of a heart attack a week before his 60th birthday. He died young, but he left behind an extraordinary body of work. He never quite recaptured the brilliance of his early Boston trilogy, The Friends of Eddie Cole, Coogan's Trade, and The Digger's Game. Later novels, like Kennedy for the Defense, have their admirers. My friend, the critic Woody Horde, is an admirer of those later novels. But eventually, this dialogue-driven style just became a bit too much. It began to drive people crazy. And we can see a parallel here with Ellroy, whose prose style and its experimentation has begun to drive people crazy. Outside of dialogue, Higgins' style is very flat. It's like he sat up, he pointed the gun, he shot the gun, he shot the guy. It's repetitive, it's kind of deadening. So you're really waiting for the dialogue to start again. I mean, you have this wonderfully cynical urban philosophy to see you through the story. It's interesting to look back to what might have been, how many rising stars never quite made it. I mean, that's putting it a bit harshly, I suppose. I mean, George V. Higgins made it. He wrote dozens of novels. He wrote non-fiction. He had an incredibly versatile career. But maybe he could have been bigger. I mean, maybe he could have had sales like Michael Connolly or John Grisham, the sort of mega sellers. But he stubbornly stuck to his guns. He stuck to his style that he knew really well, and he did better than anybody else. And fair play to him. Perhaps the books became a bit tedious as a consequence, and certainly Ellroy has tested the patience of his readers, even his most fervent admirers, with his style. But that's how it all happened. So, to sum up, The Digger's Game is an absolutely marvellous novel. It's George V. Higgins at his best, and he never quite became the mega-selling author he could have been. But when you've influenced an author like James Ellroy, and when you've inspired him, not just to actually have the confidence to sit down and put pen to paper, and it is pen to paper because Ellroy still doesn't type, never used a typewriter, let alone a computer. When you've done that sort of thing, that's a legacy to be proud of. And go out, buy yourself a copy of The Digger's Game. It's an absolutely marvelous novel. A little bit forgotten today. You could make a marvelous film along with the friends of Eddie Coyle and Coogan's Trade, and that's why I picked it for Ellroy Reads, because I'm trying to get to you the novels that people have forgotten, and this one this one is absolutely marvelous. Okay, thank you for listening, and join me next week for another episode of Ellroy Reads. See you next time.